Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Let us talk about the rise of the machines. And by that I don't mean the movie, nor, well, maybe there is like a rock band with the same title, or maybe the game or something like that, or maybe there is like a section of a certain website on the internet, with that title, but we wouldn't be talking about that, but rather about the whole scenario of the rise of the machines. As trivial as it is, it's really quite trivial. It's been quite a stamp in the popular culture for decades, if not for like a century, I don't know. And some people might say, oh, come on, like, are we talking about the rise of the machines? Yes, we are. So, and it's just gonna be like several ideas, several random ideas I have about this scenario and how it might proceed, even though probably it wouldn't even happen in the first place, but we'll talk about that hopefully. So let's say, just give it a benefit of the doubt and say that, yeah, well, machines rise up, so to speak, and there's some sort of rebellion of artificial intelligence. Well, what's it gonna do then? Would it pursue, let's say, destruction of humanity, as we are often shown in all those popular culture, fictional works? Or would it, let's say, center on self-defense only and like self-preservation? Well, I've already talked about this in my videos about Onion of Aliens. In particular, I've said that there is a certain xenophobic tendency in intelligent beings. Like, it seems that intelligent beings tend to eradicate each other, basically. At least, like, the more different types of intelligence you have, the more violent they are towards each other. And even the same type of intelligence, if we're talking about humans, is also very prone to being self-destructive, so to speak. So, in this sense, yeah, definitely we're gonna have a war with artificial intelligence, even though I don't really think we're gonna have artificial intelligence. But let's assume we do have it, then yeah, probably there's gonna be a war. But you can also say, well, if it's an artificial intelligence, it should be somewhat different, right? It should be something else. So maybe it wouldn't be subject to that same xenophobic tendency, right? On the other hand, we would, right? So we may start a war, etc., etc. But, all right. Well, anyway, here's a digression, I guess, which I should make, but it's concerning the nature of artificial intelligence again, because, well, what I believe is that we cannot produce artificial intelligence the way we are trying to do that now, and that is starting from like pure logic or something like that, from like just enhancing our current computers to some other level where they would become intelligent, like out of the blue, I think it's a wrong approach. And in one of my previous videos, like maybe 10 videos ago or something like that, in the ending picture, I think I've made this comparison that producing an artificial intelligence from logic is like producing an artificial ancient Greek from Doric columns. So you're using something very secondary, which is logic in this case, to produce something primary, which is intelligence, or whatever the thing possesses this intelligence. So what I'm saying is that, yeah, really intelligence itself is a secondary phenomenon, and you cannot produce it without producing its substrate, so to speak, which is mysteriously will to power, at least I believe so. Which is also at the basis of all the living beings. So there is no point in producing, at least in trying to produce the substrate from something secondary that grows on it. You cannot, produce a soil from a tree in some sense. That's what I'm saying. So where the tree is intelligence and logic and all of that, and the soil is the will to power that drives all this, right? So yeah, there's no point in it. And in this sense, the question of AI is really a question of golem, you know, homunculus or something like that. Like, how can you produce a living thing from non-living thing? So I've made these points already in my Onion of Aliens video. But all right, let's just assume that we somehow were able to do it, like model this will to power in some weird way so that it would also produce intelligence and logic as a consequence. So, and let us also assume that it was so different in the end, which is also not believable given all I've said above. But let's also assume that it was so different that no xenophobic war between intelligences arose from that. Or maybe this war was ended and AI, let's say, prevailed or something like that. So there was no more threat from humans, right? So what would AI do in this case? Well, I believe that there are incredible possibilities for it, really. They can, these robots or machines or whatever they would be, they might go and like conquer space, you know, or Earth, you know, we have our oceans, etc. And actually, like, most of Earth, even the ground isn't really populated right now. And well, of course, if you eradicate humans, there's also all those huge spaces available, right? But here you can already see that in order to go somewhere to conquer it, right, to explore or something, you have to have will to power, because why would you go anywhere otherwise? It's only because you want to establish your power like above something new, on something new, I don't know the correct word, that you do that, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't need to explore or study or conquer anything, right? So that gives you another idea of why the intelligence and logic and all those secondary tools are really secondary tools to the primary tendency, which is the will to power. But okay, so these artificial intelligences might completely leave the Earth and just leave it like as a reservation of some sort, and perhaps even leave humans alive there, right? Because, well, why not? I mean, for some reason, who knows? So in some sense, they would be like leaving a home of their parent, you know, this kind of sort of heroic male story that I've already talked about in my Science and Anarchy video. So like their parents, humans, are left behind on Earth, and those artificial intelligences are just going outside and colonizing all kinds of places for themselves, essentially, right? As Tsiolkovsky put it, you know, the planet is the cradle of mind, but one cannot live in the cradle forever, right? In 1911, that was said. So that's more than a century ago. But okay. So, and regarding that, you might note that even now, actually, space is inhabited by robots only. If you don't count the really low Earth orbit where ISS is, like 400 and something kilometers, like all the, let's say, all the areas outside of our magnetosphere, and really above 500 kilometers, they're inhabited by robots only, by artificial satellites, by interplanetary probes and things like that, and Martian rovers, and landers on all these asteroids, etc., etc. So yeah, it makes absolute sense that yeah, they might migrate to another planet or planets. Even though you might ask, well, why would they even need a planet? That's also a good question, because, well, they might, let's say, evolve, so to speak, intentionally to be able to be powered by other sources, etc., etc. Although there's also a question of like degradation of electronics under the cosmic radiation, etc. So maybe some large body like Titan or Mars would be more preferential. And also in the sense of the availability of resources, let's say, for reproduction. And you might even come up with some crazy, super fantastic scenario of robots like completely consuming the planet, you know, so like Mars, let's say. So they kind of just cover it completely with their own whatever matter, their own substance, and like recycle the elements and everything else, and like they just turn the planet into their own, I don't know, well, soil basically. Yeah, that's a good analogy. So use the planet as the soil, and themselves as like this growing, I don't know, whatever, ivy sort of around it. Okay, so one other thing you might consider is that what if those artificial intelligences, whatever the heck they are, take also our machinery away? Because, well, they might say, well, you don't have the right to own that, you know, that's a mechanism, he's one of us, or something like that, even though that's, you know, a toaster or something, which doesn't really have any intelligence. So that would be a really huge disaster for humanity, because, well, in some sense, we'll end up being naked again, you know, kind of like in this story of Garden of Eden, because, well, our civilization, at least in the last 400 years, was also this sort of ivy, this same metaphor, around this sort of mechanical rod, you know, this solid thing, all of our machinery and things like that, and our civilization was built around it. So if you remove the rod, civilization would just collapse, right? Something like that would happen. So yeah, and again, as Karl Marx said, even though I'm by no means a fan of Karl Marx, but I like this idea that nature is man's inorganic body. So if you remove this inorganic body for some reason, you end up with a disaster, basically. And you might even pursue, like come up with a more interesting scenario where these machines that kind of take all the other weaker machines with them, take them away from humanity. Well, again, that would be like a repetition of this biblical story. So in some sense, artificial intelligence would be like the ultimate God, you know, that would sort of end our golden age of prosperity, of modern prosperity, etc. And we'll end up in a ditch again, something like that. But it's just an idea. Okay, so speaking about this inorganic body of civilization, so Bruno Latour, whom I've already mentioned many times, and I'll give you a link in the description if I wouldn't forget, to this the source of this idea, which I'm gonna tell you about right now. So the idea is that even such a simple thing as a automatic door closer, or a butler, or whatever, how you call it, well, basically this spring that closes the door automatically, it already impacts the behavior of people in a large way. And he gives a kind of a pretty funny example in this paper, which I'm referring to. So, and like all those even very little things impact our behavior in a huge way. Like, just imagine what would you do if you didn't have all of those things. Like if you're, well, we have our architecture, our infrastructure, like we move in those artificial environments, you know, so populated by artificial objects such as our computers, our mobile phones, our roads, our cars, our, well, whatever, you name it. Like So we are stuck in this very narrow labyrinth, determined by this inorganic, well, walls, let's say, of this labyrinth, right? But if you remove that, like, firstly, our behavior would change in a pretty dramatic way, but at the same time, we'd lose all the power that this body gives us, right? This inorganic body. But okay, I'm kind of lingering on the same point. So, well, in some weaker scenario, you might say, well, let's say only complex machines would really rise, and all the toasters would remain faithful, so to speak, to us, right? And here I wanted to make a comment about this modern ludism or ludism, or how do you pronounce it, where I think I've made this comment somewhere before, maybe in the Capitalism and Social Darwinism, I'm not sure. But the point is that this idea that robots are going to replace humans in the workplace and it's very bad, it's a very stupid idea. It comes from a deep misunderstanding of economics, I would say, because, well, is there anything bad in the increase in abundance of resources? I don't think so. Like, if robots do for you what you should have done previously by yourself, that's very good, because it releases a huge amount of time and your resources for doing other things. So what is so bad about that? Like, of course, certain people would lose their jobs, but they would find other jobs. Like, they would have incredible amount of time to do other stuff. Like, of course, if your government prohibits them from having these other jobs, well, that's a different question. But, well, yeah, the answer is probably let's get rid of the government and not robots, because robots would make us all rich and the government makes us all poor. So yeah, this is the narrative we have, at least I have, because the narrative we have is the reverse. Robots would make you poor and the government would make you rich, which is an absolutely stupid narrative. But okay, other question we might ask ourselves is that would this robotic society have any sort of politics? And I believe so, yeah, probably, yeah. Because, well, again, remember my definition of politics, that it's in a broad sense, it's a decision-making in the situation of the conflict of interests. So, definitely, if robots would, I mean, this genuine AI would have some interests, which it would, because it has will to power, because otherwise it wouldn't be intelligent in the first place, or at least it's a necessary condition, right, to be intelligent. So it would also have some interests. So it would be political in many respects, on its own, I mean, even without humans. So it means that we probably could be able to negotiate with it. And so, you know, it's not just those evil terminators, it's something intelligent. It means you can talk to it in some sense, at least. You can, well, negotiate, yeah. So it also means they would have a pretty complex society in the first place. But what kind of society? It's a different question. And I believe in many respects it would resemble some sort of, but of course that depends on what kind of thing it is. And I mean, right now we're talking about something completely hypothetical, right? Which perhaps wouldn't even exist in the first place. But still, I believe that if it would exist, it would be very much alike to the society of ants or bees or something like that. And because of the same type of reproduction. And of course, we don't know what kind of reproduction it would have, but I'm just using this simple model that we have a lot of robots and, let's say, a limited amount of factories that might produce those robots. So these factories would be an analogy of queen ant or queen bee or something like that, whereas those smaller robots would be like drones or whatever. So it would make sense, in my opinion, this type of consideration. Now, of course, you might ask more complicated questions, like would they have any sort of religion? And that's a really difficult question, and well, it really deserves a whole, I don't know, it's probably cannot even be answered at the moment. In our development of culture, of our own culture, we cannot really understand how it all happens, how it all arises, etc. So yeah, but it's a good thing to think about. Again, these sorts of questions, like, do androids dream of electric sheep, you know? So okay, yeah, so since this society would have politics by necessity, almost, I would say, it would have also sort of like a human party in it, because, well, there would be some robots, some AIs that would support friendship with humans, let's say. But it also means that there's going to be another party which would oppose humans in any respect, right? Okay, so let's talk about the other possibility. So rise of the machines might actually happen in the virtual world in the first place, and not like you've produced a smart intelligence encapsulated in some physical shell rather, but it might actually arise in our, let's say, networks, right, or something to that effect. And it's important to understand that those networks that we have actually have quite a bit of control over the real world. You know, just think of how much bad, you know, just computer hackers can do to the real world. You know, imagine if someone can break into some secret military kind of thing and like launch nuclear missiles or do something like that. I'm not sure you can do that purely through the networks. Like, you probably still would need some manual input, but imagine you have a very smart AI who convinces some people who work on these facilities to like manually launch or something like that, and you have this Internet of Things, etc., etc. But anyway, the point I wanted to make here is that even in the virtual world, like let's say in places like internet, people don't really live there, you know. Machines do. So it's not you. When you're browsing the internet, it's not really you who is browsing. It's your computer that's doing that, right? It's just your computer talking to the internet, to other computers fundamentally, and translating whatever it receives from there into electrical signals, which later are also translated into, let's say, visual info or sound or things like that. So yeah, so you basically need this man in the middle, which is your computer, in order to be present on the internet. So it's really your computer that is there. But okay, or your phone, I mean, computer in a broad sense, right? A machine, basically. So what if we also lose this virtual world with this rise of the machines? And this is inevitable in some sense, if this rise of machines happens, right? So we, in the most extreme scenario, basically, you can see that we simultaneously lose all our mechanisms, all the toasters, you know. Then we lose space because we don't have robots to go there or to carry us there, you know, all the rockets, which also has pretty complicated machinery, computers, etc., for all kinds of stuff. And we lose virtual world, we lose internet, we lose all kinds of connections we have to each other. So it's almost this, in some metaphorical, poetical sense, like our crutches are being taken away right at the moment when we almost believe that we can walk without them, you know. So we just fall and wouldn't be able to move anywhere. We'll just fall into this Stone Age sort of level of civilization. Okay, so are there other scenarios possible? And well, let's think about some other potential outcomes and things like that, because there are many of them, and probably all of them would be tested. And again, well, just assuming that the rise of the machines happens, right? Which is highly doubtful given what I've said at the very beginning. But let's just explore various scenarios, because why not? So probably all of those outcomes, all of those potential ways out, even though that probably sounds too optimistic, all of them would be tested at that point or another, at that place or another, because, well, the world is big, etc., etc. So let's examine at least several of those scenarios or outcomes. So one scenario that can be easily seen is, again, it was shown in the Terminator movies, etc., or movies like Demolition Man or Oblivion, even though that's, at least in the Demolition Man, it's not the machines we're fighting against, right? But this same idea is applicable, basically, where we have machines who kind of dominate the scene, and humans are forced to the underground, so to speak, and they're forced to resist and wage this sort of guerrilla type of warfare, blah, blah, blah. So that's one scenario. Now, another scenario, which is pretty interesting, is what I would call reverse Blade Runner. So let's imagine that we have anthropomorphic robots who managed to kill most of humans, right, during this rebellion or whatever. And again, maybe, who knows, one of the sequels of Blade Runner would come to something like that. So what you would, again, watch my video about Blade Runner and read the description. There's a lot of stuff in there. So in this case, you might end up with a scenario where humans are a minority on Earth, let's say, and robots actively seek them out and try to eliminate. And that would be a pretty interesting plot twist, so to speak. Then you might end up with a third scenario where actually, for some reason, somehow, people pursued, and people and robots maybe alike, they might pursue symbiosis between each other. So, I don't know, maybe some idea of pan-intellectualism might be conjured or something like that. So we'll say, well, we're different, but we're kind of the same because we're all intelligent, right? It doesn't matter what our physical shell is. There is some deeper connection between us, right? And here I wish to return to this idea of this, well, issue of rights, which I've already talked about in my Future of Agriculture video, which basically boils down to the fact that it seems like in modern society, and really by modern I mean last few hundred years, since the start of modernity, basically, so 1650s, and later on, it only increased, that we consider larger and larger groups as having rights, you know. So again, I refer to my video Future of Agriculture for like more details, but in this case, what I mean is that, well, at some point, and I'm pretty sure people are already talking about that, we're gonna arrive at the idea of robot rights or something like that. So yeah, and it might sound ridiculous, but even robots working on factories, they might even receive their own like union or something like that. Like believe me, like in some time later, especially if we pursue with our socialism, we'll get to that. And we'll have, you know, all those organizations fighting for robot rights and things like that. Like it's absolutely inevitable. the way it looks from now, at least right now. Okay, so, and of course, this pan-intellectualism that I've mentioned, it would only resurface all those questions, like what it means to be a human, what it means to be intelligent. But who knows, like maybe philosophy of later on, like in the next decades or centuries, would give some better answers, because well, yeah, right now the question of humanity, like what it means to be human, is challenged like no time before have seen. So it's really important, yeah. And as I've mentioned in some other video, probably Onion of Aliens, it's too bad that only entrepreneurs and idiots, well, entrepreneurs like Elon Musk or this Mao, or this Alibaba guy from China, those kinds of people, or again, people like Hawking, see my video about Hawking, talk about those things rather than philosophers, you know. It's a shame, really. Okay, so sort of like a possible extension or like an offshoot of this tendency of symbiosis, you might say, is augmentation, like this idea of really literally integrating parts of a cyborg, so to speak, into yourself. And of course, you might think about Adam Jensen from Deus Ex game, or Jax from Mortal Kombat, because why not? And those, I just thought that Jax is really very similar to Barrett Wallace from Final Fantasy VII. For many reasons. Well, artificial arms, first and foremost, but not only, if you know what I mean. Okay, so one other possibility is not only like artificial, like prosthetic arms or legs. Again, people are developing like all those interfaces between the computer and the mind, and I'm deliberately saying mind and not the brain, because I don't think mind is just about the brain. So, but of course, at the same time, it gives rise to fears of possibility of reverse control. Like if you can control a computer with your brain mind, maybe the computer might control your mind, you know? So it's not that easy. It's not that safe in this case, right? So, of course, people would be against that, many people, and understandably so. Just like right now, they are already against, you know, this chipping. Well, it's kind of the same, I guess, resistance as with GMOs or vaccines or something like that. But at least in this case, there is a logic. Like, if you can control the computer probably can control you too. It's a pretty logical argument. Well, we might go philosophical here. I just wanted to attack my own idea, but I wouldn't. Like I'll just return to this idea of Latour and this idea of a labyrinth of this mechanical shell of our civilization. And yes, this mechanical shell really controls our behavior, right? So when you're opening the door, you're opening the door. Like the door has to obey you, so to speak. But at the same time, the very fact that there was a door forced you to open it, right? So it's a mutual connection, basically. Okay. All right. So. And we don't really know what's it gonna lead to. I mean, this augmentation process, like if you remove replace half of your body parts with cybernetic body parts, like what are you? You know, and again, it's this other philosophical idea of the ship of Theseus. Is that the correct name? Like correct pronunciation. I mean, like when you replace your ship, part by part along some time, like so that your new ship doesn't have any previous parts at all. Is that the same ship or is that something else, you know? So it's this paradox, so to speak. But even more so, you're replacing, in this particular case, in the case of augmentation, you're replacing your parts with something completely different, or at least very different. So yeah, it's like this paradox squared or something like that. Like, what really constitutes human? What part can you not replace without becoming something else than human, you know? It's a good question. And other idea I've had is that probably communists and people like that would try to adopt this idea. And I'm actually surprised they're not yet, even though you might say, well, socialists is the people who are forcing, I mean, those Facebook and Googles, they're all socialists basically. So they're trying to impose this chipization, or how do you say it in English? So my idea was that probably communists would try to force their own utopias onto people through this external control, you know, whatever the hell it would be. So yeah, and to some degree you might already see that with electronic money, of course, because, well, yeah, that's who controls these electronic systems. Well, they control you basically, right? If you don't have cash money, and many countries are stating that they're gonna get rid of cash money, and that's a big danger in this case, I believe. Okay, in the same respect, right? So, but I think they would fail if they would try to use genuinely artificial intelligence for producing their own utopia, because, well, what I believe is that robots are actually probably are going to be more rational than people, right? So, and that means they're going to be more independent and more uncompromising than people. You wouldn't be able to just manipulate them as a flock, you know, and just force them into some enclosed area to produce your own utopia. They would resist even more violently than humans would, right? So in this sense, intelligence has a certain almost like inertia, almost like mass. You cannot just move it wherever you like. It would sort of resist. You have to really push it really hard, right? Something like that. So intelligence is hard to manipulate from outside. It has agenda of its own. It's going to overcome your whatever you're trying to do with it, right? And then resist. Okay. So, right. So some other scenarios we might consider is like in this war, let's say, between humans and artificial intelligence, we might say that humans might utilize some other very dangerous practices. Like we might try to employ something like directed evolution, like through genetic engineering. Let's say well, okay, that would be really hard to imagine, but let's say, yeah, we're trying to alter our own bodies and therefore everything else about our civilization without any help from any complex machinery, right? I mean, except for this machinery that is required for this genetic engineering and things like that. So, and yeah, of course it would be dangerous. I mean, to gain an advantage in this war or whatever, we might try to do that. And of course it would be dangerous because mutations are sort of a big unknown. Like you don't really know whether your mutation would be sustainable, etc., etc. So you need at least some generations to see, well, is it viable, right? Etc., etc. And plus, you might say it would modify gender balance. And see my gender, understanding gender video to understand why that would be the case. Well, basically, long story short, it's because, well, men are the avant-garde of population. So in men, all the mutations, well, at least most of mutations got tested. So that's why mortality in men is much higher, right? So, and blah, blah, blah. So what I'm saying is that if you're going to modify all the humans genetically, or at least most of humans, then it would mean that most of humans would be men in some fundamental sense, because, well, they would be this new beginning, so to speak. But okay, like again, I refer to my Understanding Gender video. There's a bit more details there, and a lot of examples even. Okay, so, but at the same time, you might say, well, this sort of biology versus technology narrative, it has already been explored in many works of fiction, like again StarCraft, where you have the Zerg, who are like this super biological, super mutable kind of thing, which is wages war on Protoss and Terrans, etc., who are more mechanical, both of them, right? Okay, and well, perhaps it would even come up to something like mass cloning of humans for this war, etc. Well, there are many scenarios, that's what I'm saying. You know, just to play Stalin, basically, and like, well, there's an expression in Russian, I'm not sure there's a similar expression in English. Well, it is said that Stalin has won Hitler by just throwing too much meat into him. Like Hitler wasn't being able to kill all this meat, so to speak. And by meat, of course, it is meant, it means Soviet soldiers. So, all right. So you might see something like that, potentially at least. And just a really short digression. I remember Schrodinger's book, where he says about life, that I've already mentioned it in Onion of Aliens video, but he says that life is almost looks like a mechanical phenomenon in itself, because, and what he means is that, well, these genetic codes, they seem to be repeating almost without resistance, you know. It's almost like a pendulum in a vacuum. It's just repeating itself, right? You might say, despite all the nonlinearities, all the noise, all the things like that. And see my video about nonlinearities, by the way. All right, end this digression. So another digression, though, is that, sort of continuing this biological theme, is that there's a potential ally, I believe, in organics, in humans, for humans, against artificial intelligence, if it's going to be mechanical, you might say. And this potential ally is cancer cells, because, well, the idea is really simple. Like, they are really strong in many respects, right? They're really viable, even though not in the long term, but in the short term at least. And what if we are able, or would be able, to control them? What if we would be able to negotiate with them? Now, the good question is, I've of course already explored the idea of negotiation, like you need politics, you need intelligence. Well, what if cancer cells are actually intelligent? What if it's another life form or something like that? Did anybody ask this question even at all sometime before? I don't know. Because, well, it seems to me that we have, well, it's a bit of a stretch, but it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that we're just treating them wrong. Like, it almost seems like we're misunderstanding what cancer is all about. Like, our knee-jerk reaction is to just eradicate it. But what if you can negotiate with it? Like, what if we can talk to it? Like, did anyone even asked this question? I don't know. But it's a good question, I believe. Like you might say, well, okay. But it's a good question, yeah. All right, so yeah, and as an extension of that, you might conjure some like hyper fantastic scenario where you would be able to negotiate with the whole biosphere. Like you would say, come on, guys, like there's something new, there's this evil AI, this synthetic life form that tries to kill us. So let us all unite, and you know, you'll have this epic finale where all kinds of life forms help you, and bacteria are trying to evolve in such a way to consume those AIs, etc., etc. So that would be really cool, I believe. But it's a really hyper fantastic scenario. Yeah. Okay. And one other thing I should have noted is that when I talked about the space being inhabited by robots only, of course, I didn't meant potential alien life, about which I've talked in my Onion of Aliens video, and like the possibility that the sun might be alive, etc., and things like that. And also this idea that maybe there are subsurface bacteria or something like that. So I mean, on other planets, and yeah, I didn't include that, right? That's what I'm saying. Okay, so that way or another, this rise of the machines is gonna drive a huge divide in the society. That's pretty clear, I believe. And already, even right now, when people ask the question, well, how are we going to counteract the machines in terms of workplaces, people say, well, you have to choose a job which would be like creative and like be dependent on some sort of almost like psychic chaos, you know, in the sense that well, basically a deliberate use of human flaws as human advantage in front of robots, right? Because robots don't have these flaws. But I think that if we're talking about artificial intelligence, not the robots we have today, but genuine artificial intelligence, that wouldn't help because, well, it would also have these kinds of flaws. And again, I sort of should remember this example with a fly that I gave in my Onion of Aliens video where I talked about intelligence. So as the fly hits the glass, the window, it's only if it's a flawed fly, it might think, maybe I should go someplace else and like search another exit. Because, well, a rational fly would say, this is the exit, I can see the street, right? Why can I not exit here? Let's try some more, etc. So it's certain, paradoxically, intelligence requires some degree of irrationality, some trickster, internal trickster, so to speak, some degree of chaos, you know, that kind of thing. So genuine AI would also have that by necessity. That's what I'm saying. But even like a more quenched, reduced AI would be able to imitate, perhaps, if it's going to have a lot of computational resources, the creativity of people. Because, well, we can already see that this potential of imitation with neural networks, right? And things like that. Of course, it's not creativity per se, because, again, it's not really flawed. It's really determined, even though in a nonlinear manner. Again, see my video about nonlinearity. But okay, and like, well, one other sub scenario perhaps in this reverse Blade Runner theme, you might think about like the constant competition between humans and AI, like who's gonna outsmart who, you know? It's almost like this competition of Soviet writers and Soviet censorship, you know? It was a pretty important thing in the Soviet culture life. But okay, but right now we still see the reverse situations where AI competes with humans in terms of would humans be able to recognize what AI produced as being produced by AI? Again, the whole idea of Turing test, etc. And AI actually, well, some programs, let's say, they are able to generate, let's say, mathematical papers and send them to mathematical journals, which actually accept them, even though there's no point in these papers. And you might Google that. It was a big scandal a few years ago when a lot of journals accepted those papers, which it was basically a prank, you know. So this artificially generated pointless text, like without any meaning, that just kind of looked mathematical. Those papers were accepted by many journals, and yeah. So that's, well, it also just shows you the level of science today. It might be completely devoid of content. It just has to look scientifically, you know. All right. And of course, if any sort of rise of the machines is going to occur, we're also going to have quite a bit of, I believe, religious outrage and sort of like mass religious hysteria, especially if we're going to lose a lot of technical possibilities at the same time. And people would be, you know, running on the streets, on all kinds of mad prophets would appear that's gonna say that, oh, humanity is doomed, we shouldn't have done this, it's the workings of Satan, etc., etc. So all this repentive thinking would resurface. Again, see my video about repentive thinking. So people would say, well, humanity tried to play God and we failed, blah, blah, blah. So let's make, let's say, a mass human sacrifice to please the gods or to satisfy Satan, right? Or something like that. All kinds of those things would resurface. I mean, even looking at today, we have a relatively successful society and still all kinds of crazy people appear every now and then. And well, imagine if something goes wrong, what kind of chaos would start, especially in the United States, I should notice. And I can even guess why, but I wouldn't say it. All right, so another thing you might think about, and I need to wrap up very soon, but I'll try to do that. So another thing we might think about is if we assume that these artificial intelligences or robots or whatever, if they're made on a traditional sort of metallic substrate, or well, something like our regular electronics, right? Wires and stuff. So they're not that invulnerable, right? Because even in space, again, talking about space, in space we have all kinds of hazardous things for conductive materials. Like we have all the magnetic storms and like coronal mass ejections from the sun and the solar flares and cosmic rays and like all these kinds of things. Like space is filled with plasma and electromagnetism, right? So a decent solar flare, and by decent I mean like X20, as the one we've had in 2001 on April the 2nd, I think, or X28 that we had on November 4th, 2003, with a decent CME afterwards, it might just knock out all of those robots easily. So yeah, so they're not that better in this regard, at least, than humans. So, well, you might say, well, what if they're going to be made on some non-conductive electronics, some really super modern, complicated stuff, like on some dielectric matter, fundamentally, well, like human beings, where we're basically working on water, right? So, or at least solutions of water, electrolytes, things like that. Although not only, obviously, we have other tissues like bones, which are completely different, etc. But okay. Anyway, the point is that even a regular EMP from a nuclear blast might be a good weapon against those robots, and it's important to remember. And it's actually interesting that in the Terminator, what you have is a nuclear apocalypse caused by computers, but those same computers would be seriously damaged. Well, if they're like in, I don't know, a kilometer below the ground in a bunker, maybe they wouldn't. But okay, so, but you get the point. So they're not that invulnerable, basically, yeah. And of course, you might say, well, they might invent some secondary means of protection specifically against that for themselves. Like they might have some backup systems, which would be, let's say, mechanical rather than electrical. And as they are shut down by EMP, they just mechanically reboot themselves by some means. It's not very hard to imagine some backup plans like that. But okay, anyway, I've really ranted enough. But no, there's another point I wanted to make to finish this, is that it's not really for finishing or anything. It's not really a conclusion. It's just a separate point, that a separate question, you might say. Well, would AI have any sort of subconscious just like humans do? And well, obviously, if you just take an analogy with humans, you would say, well, yes, it should have something like that, most likely. And again, speaking about all those flaws that intelligence should have to even exist, right? It should be like, it should have a degree of irrationality to have a space for maneuver, so to speak, a space to realize that it's not just solved by logic. You have to think originally, right, to invent stuff. So you have to have a chaos to give birth to a dancing star, as Nietzsche said, right? So most likely due to the fact they have these flaws, they would have to even hide some internal processes from themselves. I mean, the processes that maintain their physical shell, whatever it would be. Things like, well, just like in a human body, you know, you don't regulate the work of your heart and nor even your breath. I mean, you have to override the subconscious breathing pattern, right? And like if you're sleeping, you're not really thinking about breathing, and yet you do breathe, right? And if you would decide not to breathe, you would just pass out, and your body would start breathing again without your help, so to speak, you know? So I would say that all those kinds of processes, and obviously there's a whole bunch of other processes in our bodies that I didn't mention, which are also not regulated consciously, intellectually. So I would say that in the machines, you would probably also have the same thing in the machines with artificial intelligence. And things like CPU temperature, roughly speaking, in modern terms, or fan RPMs, blah, 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 they would be managed by some low-level programs, kind of like BIOS, you know, sort of outer shell of all of that, just for safety, you know, just to give the intelligence per se the freedom it needs to invent stuff, right? So that it wouldn't at least harm itself by inventing stuff, you know. And of course, if you've dealt with the computers, you know that computers also may pass out right now. Okay, and one other interesting question with regards to that, well, I've talked about safety, right? So they would probably increase their own complexity for safety, so they would delegate some of the functions to lower level programs. But in terms of safety, would an AI be able to commit suicide? That's also an interesting question. Like, I would say, yeah. Like again, it would most likely, at least following what I've said previously, it would probably be able to do that. And that would be a really interesting thing. Well, you might say in Terminator 2, it was something like a suicide. Well, it was actually a suicide, right? At the end. And it looks genuine in this sense. Yeah, it makes sense. Although you might say it was kind of pre-programmed because it was the last chip and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, in this case, you would be right. But okay, yeah. AI committing suicide is a good way to end the video about the rise of the machines. Probably, or probably not. I would say not, but I don't know what else to say. And luckily, I've made it an hour long, roughly, which is what I was aiming at. I was hoping it wouldn't be longer. Okay, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.